The October wind came down sharp from the high ridges, curling grit along the boards of the main street, rattling a loose sign above the mercantile, making every sound lean thin and cold. Andrew Hudson drew the reins with a practiced hand, his mare stamping against the chill, steam rising in soft bursts from her nostrils. Beside him on the wagon bench, his 5-year-old daughter clung to the folds of his coat, eyes darting wide at the scatter of town noise, wagon wheels groaning, a hammer clanging at the blacksmith's, laughter spilling rough from the saloon doors. Her cheeks were red with the cold, but her small hand pressed steady against his arm, a quiet tether. He had meant only to fetch salt, beans, and lamp oil, perhaps flour if the price had not climbed again. The trip itself was nothing remarkable, until he saw her. At first, she was only a thin shape near the butcher's refuse, bent low, fingers trembling as they reached into a barrel of scraps. A girl grown to womanhood, yet so gaunt she looked carved of shadow. Her black hair hung loose, strands clinging to her cheeks. A torn sleeve left her arm bare to the wind. She lifted a piece of spoiled bread to her lips, not even waiting to brush away the grime. Andrew felt his daughter stiffen, her breath catch. Then came the cruel sound, laughter, high and cruel as glass breaking. 2 boys, not much older than 12, had gathered pebbles and were tossing them, each strike aimed to sting. One stone caught her shoulder, another bounced off the slats of the barrel. She flinched, but made no sound, clutching the bread like a secret she dared not lose. Around her, grown men leaned on posts, women stepped around with baskets, all seeing but not stopping. The sight was common enough, another foreign soul adrift on the tide of the frontier. To them, she was trouble made flesh. Andrew's jaw set. He pulled the reins and the wagon slowed. The boys laughed louder, emboldened. One picked a larger rock. Andrew stepped down before the wagon had even halted, boots crunching hard in the dust. His shadow cut across the street. The boys froze as he came forward, his height filling the space like a door shut tight. He said nothing, only looked. That look, cold, level, carrying the quiet weight of a man who had buried a wife too young and worked soil too long, was enough. The rock slipped from the boys' fingers, and both scattered into the alleys without another word. The woman did not flee. She remained crouched, breath shallow, eyes dark pools fixed not on him but on the bread clutched to her chest. When Andrew extended his hand, she flinched as though expecting another blow. He did not touch her. He only crouched, knees creaking, so their eyes met. She was younger than he had first thought, perhaps 20, maybe 22, but hunger had carved deep hollows in her face. Dirt smudged her cheek, but her gaze held a stubborn dignity beneath the fear, as though she had been taught once never to beg yet had been driven past that teaching. Behind him, his daughter's small voice carried soft, "Papa!" Andrew stood slowly and turned toward the mercantile. He entered without another glance, the warmth of sawdust and flour sacks enveloping him. He bought bread, a half-loaf fresh from the oven. When he returned, she was still crouched there, shivering, eyes fixed on the ground. He broke the loaf in 2, set half in her hands. She stared as though he had offered gold, lips parting but no words coming. His daughter leaned forward from the wagon seat, offering the small biscuit she had saved from breakfast. The woman's fingers trembled as she accepted, and when her eyes lifted to the child, a single tear cut a clean path through the grime on her cheek. The moment should have ended there, charity given, charity taken. But the silence of the onlookers had shifted, whispers threading through the street. The sheriff emerged from the saloon porch, hand resting on the butt of his pistol, his face a map of weary authority. "Hudson," he called, voice flat. "You don't want to be meddling. She ain't yours to feed. Word is, there's men looking. Best let her be." His tone held no threat, only the shrug of a man who'd seen too much and learned to choose comfort over conscience. "Chinamen bring trouble," he added, spitting into the dust. Andrew met his gaze but said nothing. He lifted the woman gently by her elbow, guiding her toward the wagon. She stumbled once, then steadied. His daughter slid aside on the bench, patting the space beside her. The woman hesitated, eyes darting as though expecting to be dragged back, but Andrew's silence steadied her. She climbed aboard. The sheriff shook his head and turned away, muttering to himself. The crowd dispersed, whispers trailing like smoke. The wagon rolled forward, wheels crunching over frost-stiff dirt. The woman clutched the bread close, taking small bites as though afraid it would vanish. Andrew's daughter watched her with the open curiosity of a child, no judgment, only a budding attachment. The father kept his gaze on the road, but inside him something restless stirred. He had come for supplies and found something else, something raw and frail, yet alive. He felt the town's eyes burning his back. New word would travel by nightfall. Still, he did not turn aside. He drove toward the open land where sky met earth in a pale horizon, where the wind carried the promise of both danger and shelter. The chill deepened as the wagon left the clustered buildings behind. The woman drew the shawl tighter around her shoulders, though it was little more than a rag. She looked toward Andrew, lips moving as if to form words, but only a whisper came, broken syllables in a tongue he could not grasp. Her eyes spoke more. Fear, shame, gratitude knotted together. His daughter, sensing the weight, placed her small hand in the woman's lap. The woman startled, then slowly covered the child's hand with her own, fingers trembling but firm. The wagon rocked along the frozen ruts, the sky above widening into a bleak October stretch. Andrew glanced once, just once, at the fragile scene beside him. The child's trust, the woman's tentative grip, the silence that bound them. Something unspoken passed through him, an understanding that what began as pity might yet become something he could not name. He looked forward again, jaw tight, the reins steady in his hands. Behind them, town life resumed, but a line had been crossed. Ahead lay open country and the long road home, and with it, the shadow of whatever pursuit would surely follow. And as the first flurries of early winter brushed against the wagon, melting on the worn boards before vanishing, he knew this moment was not the end of it but the beginning. The wagon rattled over the ruts as the land opened wide, rolling hills patched with frost and the last brittle grass of autumn. The air smelled of smoke and cold earth, sharp in the lungs. Andrew's daughter had grown drowsy on the ride, her small head nodding against his arm, but every so often she lifted her eyes to study the woman beside her, as though making certain she remained there and had not vanished like a dream. The woman, Mei Lin, though he did not know her name yet, sat with a half loaf of bread clutched in her lap, taking the smallest of bites, as if stretching the taste to last forever. She did not ask where they were going, nor did he say. Words had never been the tools he trusted most. Silence told enough when the land itself had such a voice. By the time the wagon rolled beneath the cottonwoods that bordered his ranch, dusk was spreading, the sky layered in iron and rose. The cabin stood plain but sturdy, logs darkened with age, smoke curling from the chimney in a steady line. Andrew swung down first, lifting his daughter into his arms before setting her on the ground. He held out a hand to the woman. She hesitated, her eyes sweeping the unfamiliar homestead, but then placed her trembling fingers in his, and he steadied her as she stepped down. She lingered near the wagon, clutching the shawl tighter around her shoulders, the sharp wind cutting through the thin fabric. He gestured toward the door. She nodded once, the motion quick, uncertain, but followed. Inside, the cabin held warmth, though it was simple. The fire glowed in the stone hearth, filling the room with the scent of pine wood. A table scarred with years of meals and work stood at the center. A shelf lined with jars of beans and corn caught the light. The air was humble, lived in, but compared to the cold streets of town, it was sanctuary. Andrew's daughter rushed in ahead, picking up her rag doll from the floor where she had left it that morning. She turned with pride, holding it out toward the stranger. The woman blinked, then gave a shy smile, the first Andrew had seen on her lips. She reached out, fingertips brushing the doll's faded dress. The child giggled, a sound that filled the cabin brighter than the fire. Andrew busied himself at the cupboard, setting out dried venison and a pot of beans to warm. He worked with steady movements, each gesture purposeful. He watched, though, from the corner of his eye. The woman stood awkwardly, as if afraid to sit, afraid to take up space. She shifted her weight, hands clasped before her. His daughter tugged at her sleeve and guided her to a chair. She lowered herself slowly, bowing her head, shoulders curved inward like a bird braced against storm. When the beans were hot, he set bowls on the table. His daughter climbed onto her chair, folding her hands in her lap, waiting with solemn patience. Andrew nodded for the woman to eat. She lifted the spoon with care, as though it might be taken from her. Each bite she savored, her eyes closing a fraction, a small hum escaping her throat. She finished slower than the child, but with a reverence that stirred something in him. It had been long since he'd seen anyone treat a meal as blessing rather than routine. Afterward, while his daughter played on the floor, the woman rose without word and gathered the dishes. Her movements were hesitant, testing. She looked at him once, question in her eyes. He gave a brief nod, and she carried the bowls to the basin, pouring water from the kettle. She washed each dish with careful precision, hands moving in silence. His daughter crawled close, curious, watching the suds form. When the woman rinsed the last bowl, she offered a small smile to the child, and again, laughter rose like a spark in the dim cabin. Andrew leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching. The image of them together. His daughter's fair hair catching firelight, the woman's dark eyes softened by an unguarded moment, settled deep inside him. For so long the house had echoed with absence. Now it carried a note of something unspoken, fragile but alive. When night came, he laid a blanket by the hearth. He meant for the woman to take it, to rest there in the warmth. But his daughter shook her head fiercely, dragging her own quilt from the cot. "She sleeps near me," she insisted, her voice clear, brooking no argument. The woman looked startled, then moved as if to protest, but the child tugged her hand with such earnestness that she yielded. Andrew said nothing. He simply watched as his daughter nestled against her, doll clutched tight, while the woman adjusted the quilt to cover them both. The fire cast them in gold and shadow. He stood a long moment, then turned away, his throat tightening against words he did not speak. Morning broke with frost thick on the window glass. The air smelled of ash and cold earth. Andrew rose early to tend the animals. When he returned, the woman was already up, sweeping the hearth with an old broom. She moved quietly, but with focus, as if the act anchored her. His daughter trailed behind, mimicking the motion with her small hands, laughter bubbling. Andrew watched from the doorway, a flicker of surprise crossing his features. The stranger was not idle. She sought place, purpose. He did not stop her. Days passed in this rhythm. She spoke little, words halting, her accent shaping each syllable with effort. Still, she learned, names of simple things his daughter showed her, gestures that filled the silence. When she offered her own name, her voice soft, he caught it, Mei Lin. He repeated it once, the sound strange on his tongue. She lowered her eyes, but a faint smile touched her lips. At supper one evening, Andrew caught his daughter watching Mei Lin with adoration plain on her face. The child whispered, "She's like Mama." The words cut sharp through him, stirring grief long buried. He looked at the woman across the table, her hair pulled back, her hands folded neatly as she waited. She did not understand the words, but she felt the weight. Her eyes lifted, questioning, and he looked away, throat tight. In the evenings, Mei Lin would hum a tune as she worked, soft and lilting, foreign yet soothing. The melody filled the cabin, wrapping around them like warmth. His daughter would curl close, eyes fluttering shut to the sound. Andrew would sit by the fire, staring into the flames, the tune seeping into him, stirring something both painful and healing. He had not expected this, a stranger's voice undoing silence that had pressed on his home for years. Yet beneath the calm, unease lingered. Andrew sensed it in the way Mei Lin glanced toward the horizon when they worked outdoors, her eyes sharp with fear at the sound of distant riders. He sensed it in her reluctance to sit too near the window, in the way she startled when the wind slammed the shutters. She was safe here, but she did not believe it would last. He did not ask, not yet. He knew enough to read the scars in her silence. One night, as he checked the latch on the door, his daughter whispered from her cot, "Papa, don't send her away. We want her." The child's voice, sleepy but certain, cut through him. He looked toward the hearth where Mei Lin lay wrapped in blankets, her face turned away, hair shadowing her cheek. For a moment, he saw not just a stranger, but something more, a piece of his home returned. He gave no answer to his daughter, only laid a hand on her head until she drifted into sleep. But her words echoed long after the fire dimmed. Snow fell the next morning, the first true taste of winter. The land outside lay muted, the fence lines blurred beneath white. Andrew chopped wood. his breath fogging in the air. When he returned, he found Mei Lin braiding his daughter's hair, fingers deft despite the girl's squirming. The child laughed, declaring herself fancy, and the woman smiled, pride flickering across her face. Andrew paused in the doorway, axe still in hand, the scene striking him with sudden force. For a heartbeat, he allowed himself to imagine this was not borrowed time, not a fragile arrangement bound to break. For a heartbeat, it felt like family. But as dusk fell, he saw tracks near the ridgeline, hoofprints cutting through the snow, fresh and sharp. Someone had been watching. He stood long at the fence, breath clouding, the cold pressing deep. When he returned inside, Mei Lin's eyes lifted to his, and in them he saw it, the knowledge of danger, the unspoken fear that what she had fled might be drawing near. She looked quickly away, tucking the blanket tighter around his daughter. Andrew's jaw set. He did not speak of what he had seen. But the air in the cabin held a new weight, like a storm building unseen. The fire crackled low, shadows climbing the walls. His daughter slept soundly, curled beneath the quilt. Mei Lin sat beside her, silent, her eyes reflecting the flames. Andrew watched them both, feeling the pull of a decision forming in the silence. For all the warmth kindled in these days, he knew now it would not go unchallenged. Somewhere out there, trouble had begun its ride. Frost clung to the windows that morning, thin veins of white crawling across the glass as though winter itself were pressing its fingers against the cabin walls. Andrew rose before dawn, the quiet of the room broken only by the steady breathing of his daughter curled under her quilt and the softer rhythm of Mei Lin on the floor by the hearth. She stirred as he reached for his coat, her dark eyes opening quickly, as if startled awake from a dream she dared not linger in. For a moment she looked at him with the wary glance of one who expects departure or command. But when he nodded toward the kettle, she understood and moved to warm the water. It had become their rhythm, silent gestures, small tasks carried between them. Yet beneath it all, Andrew felt a pressure building, an unspoken question of how long such fragile peace could last. As the fire took hold, Mei Lin sat across from him at the table, her shoulders wrapped in his late wife's shawl, a garment that still smelled faintly of cedar. She cradled her cup of hot water as though it were more precious than coffee itself. The silence stretched, but Andrew did not rush it. He had learned in the years of ranching alone that silence could carry meaning greater than words. Still, the time had come for answers. He set his cup down with deliberate care and met her eyes. "Where from?" he asked softly, shaping the words slow. She hesitated, confusion flickering, then touched her chest. "Mei Lin," she whispered, voice barely audible. He nodded. "Mei Lin." She repeated his daughter's name next, halting but clear, a soft Clara, and then his own, Andrew. Each name carried the weight of introduction, of bond forming, though her tongue stumbled on the sounds. When he asked again, "Where?" she faltered. She glanced at the door as if the world beyond still held claim over her. He waited. At last she drew in a shaky breath and lifted her sleeve. The firelight fell across her wrist where faint scars showed, round and ridged, the marks of rope or chain. She lowered her eyes, then pressed her fingers together as if counting. In broken words she told it, a story jagged and spare, but heavy in its pieces. "San Francisco," she began. "Ship, father sell. Promise, husband." She touched her throat, shook her head. "Not husband, owner." The word dropped like a stone between them. Her voice trembled as she sketched fragments. The auction, the long miles west, the men who traded her like cattle, the house where she was kept until she fled under cover of night. Shame and fear twisted her words, but she forced them out, each syllable like a wound reopened. Andrew listened in silence, jaw set. He did not interrupt, though his hand clenched tight around his cup until the knuckles whitened. His daughter stirred in her sleep, and he glanced toward her, the innocence of her small form bathed in firelight. Then he returned his gaze to Mei Lin, whose eyes shone with unshed tears. She lowered her head, shoulders curling inward. "Run," she whispered. "Always run. No safe." She shook her head firmly, as if warning him. "Bad men find." Andrew rose, the chair scraping softly against the floor. He walked to the door, lifted the latch, and stared out at the pale land stretching into dawn. The horizon lay bruised in shades of gray and rose. He thought of the hoofprints he had seen near the ridge days earlier. He thought of the way Mei Lin startled at every sound. Trouble was not just memory. It was moving toward them. By midday, Clara had pulled Mei Lin outside to help scatter feed for the chickens. The girls' laughter spilled across the yard, bright against the muffled hush of snow. Mei Lin crouched low, showing her how to scatter grain in even arcs, her long sleeves brushing the child's shoulders. Andrew watched from the barn as he mended a harness. There was grace in the woman's movements, a patience that belied her fear. Yet her eyes flickered often to the horizon, her body tensing at the distant echo of hoofbeats that might be only his neighbors. He knew then that whatever past she carried was not finished with her. That evening a rider arrived. Thomas Grady, neighbor from the next valley, dismounted with snow on his hat brim and urgency in his eyes. "Heard tell at the saloon," he said, stamping his boots. "Couple fellas asking after a Chinese girl. Said she run from her man, and they aim to bring her back." His voice dropped lower. "One of M's Elias Cutter. You know the name." Andrew did. Cutter was a trader, a man who dealt in misery, feared not for his gun but for his ruthlessness. Grady's gaze slid past Andrew to the cabin's glow. "If she's here, Hudson, you best be ready. Men like him don't leave quiet." Andrew's hand tightened on the doorframe. "She's here," he said simply. Grady swore under his breath. "Then watch yourself. Cutter don't forgive." He mounted again, spurred his horse, and vanished into the dusk, leaving only the warning echoing in Andrew's ears. Inside, Mei Lin read the truth in his expression before he spoke. She rose, trembling, clutching her shawl. "I go," she whispered. "No bring danger here." She moved toward the door, but Andrew caught her arm, gently yet firm. "No," he said. "Not again." His voice was low, steady, the kind of tone that left no room for argument. She stared at him, breath quick, lips parted as if she did not believe what she heard. His daughter, sensing the tension, came to stand between them, her small hand grasping Mei Lin's fingers. "Stay," Clara said simply. The word cut clean through the fear. Mei Lin's knees buckled, and she sank onto the chair, tears sliding down her face. That night Andrew sharpened his rifle by the fire, the scrape of stone against steel filling the silence. Mei Lin sat nearby, hands clasped tight, watching every movement. Clara leaned against her shoulder, half asleep, unaware of the storm gathering. Andrew's thoughts were heavy. He had not sought this, had not invited danger. Yet he could not turn away. He remembered the way the boys had thrown stones at her in town, how the sheriff's eyes had warned him off. He remembered the way his daughter's hand had slipped trustingly into the woman's lap. Some lines, once crossed, could not be walked back. The days that followed carried a tension as sharp as the cold air. Andrew worked the ranch with one eye on the horizon. Mei Lin moved through the cabin quietly, cooking, mending, braiding Clara's hair, but always listening, always alert. At night, Andrew sometimes caught her standing at the window, staring out into the dark, her face pale with dread. Once, in a moment unguarded, she spoke. "They hurt me if fined. Hurt child." She looked at Clara asleep on the cot, her voice breaking. "Better I go." Andrew rose, crossed the room, and laid his hand on her shoulder. "No one touches her," he said. "No one touches you." His words were heavy, not promise but vow. She turned toward him, searching his face as if to weigh its truth. At last she gave a small nod, though fear lingered in her eyes. The snow deepened. Tracks appeared often now on the ridge, riders passing, circling. Once, Andrew spotted 3 men at distance, their silhouettes dark against the pale sky. He stood on the porch, rifle in hand, until they turned away. When he told Mei Lin, her face blanched, her lips trembling. "Cutter," she whispered. "He come." The cabin became both haven and trap. Firelight glowed against the log walls, but outside, the land stretched open, offering no cover. At supper Clara asked innocently, "Will she be my mama now?" The words struck like an arrow. Mei Lin gasped softly, her hand rising to her mouth. Andrew froze, spoon half raised. His daughter looked between them, her eyes bright with certainty. She sings me songs. She stay. Mei Lin bowed her head, tears slipping down her cheeks, while Andrew's chest ached with both grief and a fierce protective fire he had not known in years. On the third night, a noise broke the quiet, a distant whistle, sharp and mocking, carrying across the snow. Andrew moved to the door, heart pounding. In the distance, faint lantern light bobbed along the ridge. He knew then that waiting would end soon. Cutter was close. He returned to the fire, met Mei Lin's terrified gaze, and said quietly, "It's time." She clutched Clara to her chest, whispering in her language, words Andrew could not understand but felt in the depth of them. The cabin seemed smaller, the air thicker, as though the very walls braced for what was coming. Andrew sat with his rifle across his knees, the firelight catching the steel. Mei Lin knelt by the hearth, rocking Clara gently until she slept, though her own eyes remained wide, fixed on the door. Outside, the wind rose, carrying with it the faint echo of hooves. The land had gone quiet, too quiet, as if holding its breath. Inside, 3 souls waited, bound now not by chance but by the certainty that before long, the past would arrive at their door. The night pressed heavy against the windows, the wind rising and falling like the breath of some unseen beast prowling the edges of the land. The fire had sunk to embers, yet no one slept. Andrew sat in his chair with the rifle laid across his knees, his boots planted firm on the wood planks. His eyes never left the door. Mei Lin crouched on the hearthrug with Clara folded against her lap, her arms wrapped around the child as though her embrace could hold back the world itself. The girl stirred now and then in her dreams, murmuring softly, but slept on, unaware of the storm gathering just beyond the timber walls. A horse neighed faint in the distance, the sound carrying through the still air. Then came the crunch of hooves breaking crusted snow, the muffled rhythm of more than one rider. Andrew rose in silence, crossing to the window. The glass was frosted, but through the narrow pane he caught the bob of lanterns, 3, maybe 4, swaying in the dark. The glow lit men's shapes, their horses plowing forward slow and deliberate. He drew a breath, steady and deep, then turned back. Mei Lin's eyes clung to his face, wide and pleading. He gave her one look, sharp but calm, telling her without words to hold fast. The riders reined up near the yard, voices carrying low but harsh. A man's laugh rang out, cold as the wind. Then a knock came, not of courtesy but of ownership, a fist striking the wood with authority. Andrew moved to the door and braced his weight behind it, rifle ready. "Hudson," a voice called, deep and oily. "You've got something of mine. Send her out, and we'll leave peaceable." Andrew's grip tightened. He said nothing. The silence stretched, broken only by Clara's faint sigh in her sleep and the hiss of wind. The voice came again, harder now. "She's a runner. Belongs to me. Ain't no business of yours. Open up, or I'll come take her." Another man jeered, a sound of spurs jingling as he shifted in the saddle. Mei Lin clutched Clara tighter, whispering in her language, her face pressed against the child's hair. Andrew lowered his head, jaw set like iron, then answered through the door, his voice level. "No one here belongs to you." For a moment there was silence, and then the crack of boots against the porch, heavy steps advancing. The latch rattled. Andrew swung the door open in a burst, rifle raised. The men flinched back at the suddenness, lantern light throwing their faces in stark lines. Elias Cutter stood foremost, a tall man with a thick coat and a sneer carved permanent on his lips. His eyes gleamed in the lantern glow, cold and certain of his power. "You'll regret that," he said, voice low. Andrew fired into the ground at his boots, snow exploding upward. The horses screamed and sidestepped, riders cursing. "Next shot won't miss," Andrew said, steady. His heart thundered in his chest, but his hands were sure. Cutter's men circled, one drawing his pistol, but Cutter held up a hand, calming them. His eyes flicked toward the cabin where he knew she was. "She's property, marked and sold. You think your law means more than mine." His words were smooth, mocking. Andrew stepped forward into the cold, boots sinking into the snow. "She's free," he said simply. The fight broke sudden. One rider swung from his horse, lunging at Andrew with a knife. Andrew sidestepped, the blade glinting past, then slammed his rifle stock into the man's jaw. The crack echoed. Another fired his pistol, the shot grazing wood from the cabin wall. Inside, Clara screamed, and Mei Lin's cry rose sharp, breaking into terror. Andrew spun, tackled the shooter to the ground, the snow staining with blood as fists and steel collided. The cold bit through his coat, but he felt only the heat of survival. Cutter moved fast, shoving the door wide, forcing his way inside. Mei Lin scrambled back, shielding Clara with her own body. Cutter's shadow filled the room, his hand reaching for her arm. "You thought you could run," he snarled. His grip clamped on her wrist, jerking her upright. Clara clung to her waist, wailing. Andrew tore free from the man he fought and surged to the door, but one of the riders caught him, grappling hard. They went down in the snow, rolling, fists landing, breath steaming in the bitter air. The rifle slipped from Andrew's hands, lost in the drifts. Cutter dragged Mei Lin toward the threshold, her feet slipping, her cries strangled. Clara clung, pulled half across the floor, and then the moment turned. Mei Lin, desperate, seized the cast-iron skillet from the hearth, swinging with both hands. It struck Cutter's shoulder, a dull, bone-deep crack. He roared, staggering, releasing her. She shoved Clara behind her, breathing ragged, eyes burning with a fire Andrew had not seen before. Cutter turned on her, rage twisting his face, drawing his revolver. Andrew broke free from the rider with a violent twist, but he was too far, too slow. Cutter leveled the gun at Mei Lin's chest. For a heartbeat, all sound fell away, the wind, the shouts, even Clara's sobbing. Mei Lin's hands trembled, her eyes darting to the floor where Andrew's revolver had fallen when he was thrown back. She lunged, fingers closing around the cold steel. Cutter sneered, certain of her weakness. But she rose, hands shaking, and fired. The blast filled the cabin, smoke curling, the recoil nearly knocking her down. Cutter staggered, his coat blooming red, his sneer frozen into shock. He collapsed onto the hearthrug, his hand twitching once before falling still. Silence held, heavy and stunned. The remaining men, seeing their leader dead, faltered. One cursed, another fled into the night. Andrew snatched his rifle from the snow and aimed, driving the rest back with the promise of death in his eyes. The last rider turned and fled, hooves pounding into darkness. Inside, Mei Lin stood rigid, the revolver clattering from her hands. Clara ran to Andrew, sobbing into his chest. He held her close, his arm steady though his body ached from blows. Mei Lin sank to her knees, staring at her hands as though they belonged to someone else, her breath ragged. Andrew stepped inside, shut the door against the howling wind, and crossed to her. He crouched low, reaching, but not forcing. Slowly, she lifted her eyes to him. They shone with fear, disbelief, and something else, relief that shook her to the core. He touched her shoulder lightly. "It's over," he said. His voice carried not triumph, but a quiet, certain strength. She blinked, then let out a sob, covering her face with her hands. Clara, seeing her, slipped from Andrew's arms and crawled into Mei Lin's lap, wrapping small arms around her neck. "Don't cry," the child whispered. "We want you." The fire hissed, flames catching again on the logs. Outside, the wind dragged Cutter's men farther into the distance, their retreat swallowed by snow. Inside, the cabin glowed with fragile warmth. Andrew looked at the two of them together, the woman who had fought her way back from chains, the daughter who had already claimed her without hesitation. His chest swelled with something he had kept locked since grief had first broken him, hope, raw and painful and alive. He bound his cuts with torn cloth, his hands steady even as blood stained the linen. Mei Lin reached to help, still trembling, but insistent. Their hands touched, her fingers brushing his skin with a tenderness that spoke what words could not. He met her gaze, the firelight soft against her face, and said low, "Stay. Me and my girl, we want you." For a heartbeat she looked stricken, as if such a thing could not be true. Then her lips parted, trembling, and she whispered, "I stay." The three of them sat close as the night stretched on, the storm clawing at the walls. But within, warmth held. Andrew's arms circled his daughter, Mei Lin resting against the other side, her head bowed in exhaustion, her breath even at last. The danger had passed, but its shadow lingered. The world beyond would whisper, would judge, would perhaps seek to break them again. Yet in this moment, bound by firelight and the strength of choice, they were no longer alone. Andrew stared into the flames, their crackle echoing like distant gunfire, then softening to a steady rhythm. He felt the weight of the night settling into memory, the image of Cutter falling, the feel of Mei Lin's trembling hands clutching the gun. He knew nothing would be easy from here. But he also knew, with a certainty that steadied him more than any rifle, that he would not let them be taken again. As the first light of dawn crept across the snow, casting long shadows through the frost-rimmed windows, Clara stirred awake and nestled between them, whispering with sleepy certainty, "Family." The word lingered, fragile yet powerful, a claim against the world. Andrew lifted his eyes to Mei Lin. She held his gaze, tears glistening but no longer only of fear. In them he saw not the woman broken in the street, but the one who had stood against her captor, who had chosen to fight. The silence between them brimmed with unspoken truth. Outside, the storm eased, the wind carrying away the last hoofbeats into distance. Inside, the cabin stood steady, its walls holding more than timber now. It held the beginning of something they had all thought lost. And as the fire burned steady, Andrew knew this was only the start, that the world would test them again, but they had already crossed the line where fear had ruled. Now it was hope that claimed them, fragile but unyielding. He laid his hand over Mei Lin's where it rested against Clara's small shoulder, a gesture simple yet binding. She did not pull away. The embers glowed brighter, the sound of the storm fading into morning silence. The danger was gone for now, but the promise remained, whatever came next, they would face it together.